Welcome to the final session of the Decolonizing Economics Summit, focused on what is to be done. The summit over the last 3 days has focused on educating about decolonizing economics in purpose and in practice. Sessions have powerfully explored how to devise strategies to create an explicitly post-capitalist society using the solidarity economy framework, strengthen existing organizations, and create a space for organizations to share best practices and collaborate across issues and constituencies towards collective liberation. If you missed any of the sessions, they will be available on videos on the summit website following the conference. Decolonizing economics is an explicit challenge to ourselves and participants to center indigenous wisdom, perspective, and knowledge. Decolonization is the path towards just social, political, and economic institutions. Our summit aimed to demonstrate real solutions to heal the land and people. This closing panel is an effort to synthesize the last 3 days' discussions. The title is an intentional reference to the seminal pamphlet written in 1902 by Vladimir Lenin, outlining a skeleton plan for going beyond fighting economic battles over wages, working hours, and the like, and towards restructuring of all of society. Questions we may be discussing include things like, in times of such complexity, where should we keep our gaze? What are the principles that we can use to guide our actions based on our values? How do we build the strongest and most powerful movement of the people, by the people, for the people? What questions can we ask ourselves to forge the path forward? What lessons must we learn from past moments of intensified resistance, both our victories and our challenges? How do we collectively not only meet the challenges of the everyday, but also build that future we know is possible? As we face ecological collapse and fascism rising across the globe, we bring together movement leaders to pose the question in no uncertain terms: what is to be done? I will provide brief introductions to each of the presenters to situate them and encourage you to look at the summit website for more details. They will also share with you more about their journey. Panelists will then share about their journey, their learnings, and their thoughts, and we'll move to a dialogue using some guiding questions following that which emerges organically. We encourage you to use the chat to post questions and comments as is noted, and to record reflections, comments, add resources to the Padlet. To introduce myself, my name is Melanie Bush. I'm on the U.S. I've spent my life engaged in movement work. At the present time, on the board of U.S. Solidarity Economy Network, May 1st Movement Technology, and work closely with Global Tapestry of Alternatives and Flatbush Mixtape, and also connected to various decolonizing networks globally. Nick Cortez is an educator, union organizer, and former chair of the California Progressive Alliance. Kali Akuno is co-founder, co-director, Cooperation Jackson, served as director of special projects in the administration of Mayor Chokwe Lumumba of Jackson, Mississippi. Mary Hooks is a 42-year-old Black lesbian, feminist, abolitionist, Pan-Africanist, mother, wife, and member of Southerners on New Ground, and part of the leadership of the movement for Black Lives. Joe Guinan is the president of the Democracy Collaborative. So we now move, starting with Nick. If you can share with us some of your journey, your learnings, and your thoughts, just as opening thoughts about what is to be done. Thank you, Nick.
Absolutely. Thank you, Melanie. And thank you to everyone for all the efforts to organize this inspiring event. And I'm very grateful to be invited here. Just a brief introduction to myself. I am an educator. I'm a full-time teacher, special education teacher, specifically in a high school setting in the southern part of the Bay Area, San Jose, California. And so yes, as Melanie was stating, I've been a longtime union activist organizing in the teachers union for years. I've worked in various levels of electoral politics, trying to get good people elected. Was involved in the public banking movement here in California early on when that was getting rolling. And volunteered in various capacities with various groups in our local area around housing, homelessness, and other pertinent issues. And also, this is Mary stating, I've been a part of the California Progressive Alliance now for a number of years. So trying to work on things more at a statewide level. And I think as far as my journey, that's kind of where I'm at right now. And just trying to build solidarity and work with good people like all the wonderful people here on this panel. Yes.
Ali?
Greetings, everybody. Kali Akuno. Trying to think of what was said in the introduction. I'm speaking to you from the moment, from New Orleans, but headed up north to Jackson. My ancestors got me on this path. I'm somebody who's fortunate enough to have been raised in radical movements and have witnessed, both the benefits that come with that in terms of consciousness, but also the sacrifices that also come with that in terms of, folks doing prison time. Several of my folks are in exile. Several people have been killed by the state. So a product of all that hard trainings from growing up subject to COINTELPRO regime and all that comes with that, both in terms of what it teaches you, how to kind of steal some of your will, but also some of the pieces that you gotta, or at least me and some of mine have been trying to work to undo is, how to build deeply, understanding the levels of infiltration that the state is willing and has demonstrated time and time again that it will commit. And I'm speaking to this directly because I think it gets more to what we're going to, dig into, like what is to be done. And part of that, in terms of answering that question, we also have to be very clear about what is being done against us, what is arrayed against us, what its aims and objectives are, and how do we work to build an alternative that deals with the powers that be in an honest way, but not lose sight and lose focus of our humanity in the process. It's not an easy thing to do, but it's a critical part of the task that we have in front of it that we'll speak to. Currently, I spend most of my conscious waking hours trying to build a local alternative in a place y'all might have heard of, hopefully you've heard of, which is called Jackson, Mississippi. And we're doing everything we can there to try and prefigure some of the things that we think we're going to need in the future to build a new world and a new society, primarily through the instruments and tools of the solidarity economy, but not just that. We're heavily drawing on traditions rooted in our culture in Mississippi, and trying to take some of what we have learned, the good, bad, and the indifferent, and share that with other folks who want to engage in like practice. so that we can federate and build the type of struggle and the type of force, political force that we need to overcome the obstacles that beset us all. So I'll stop there.
Thank you both. Mary?
Hello, friends. What a treat to be on with everybody. It's always good to hear folks' stories and how they come to this work. And just super, super grateful to be on Team Justice with all of you. Again, I'm Mary Hooks. I use she and her pronouns. I'm based here in Atlanta and Atlanta, Georgia. And I come into this work as someone I think who for a very long time in my coming of age years, looked around and saw the conditions my family, my neighborhood, was in, deeply impacted by the war on drugs, deeply impacted by the job loss. My people are from Mississippi, but migrated north to Racine, Wisconsin. And so, just growing up and seeing my people suffering and in their addiction and, my cousins and folks getting involved in the street life. And I just grew up thinking it was our fault. I just grew up thinking that, something's wrong with us, like our people, And so for a moment I joined the church, and I would say that's where I first learned to organize is through the Church of God in Christ. And learn how to talk to people, really, and meet people where they're at and spiritually connect with folks. And those sort of skills, whether I knew it or not, was setting me up. It was setting me up. And fast forward some years later, after I come out of as a lesbian, Black woman saved my life. I moved south and, was introduced to the possibility of doing something, and the watershed moments have been happening around the country, around the world, the war, Katrina, Gina 6, all these different flashpoint moments, where I'm just like waitressing, you know what I mean? Just living life and seeing these things happening and like, just like feeling like I need to do something, but having no idea, literally y'all, no idea, what was to be done. And until I met a woman and she said that she was trying to stop the shackling of giving birth while in prison. And I was floored that it was happening, but I think I was more taken aback that there's actually something you could do about it. And then the more I learned that, like all things, particularly when it comes to this movement, you get an invitation, unless you're born in it and stuff, you get an invitation because a good organizer organizes you. And I got organized into the membership of Southerners on New Ground. And since I think that was 2010, I've committed my life to this work. And so part of my assignment, once I I joined the staff of Song maybe 3 years after I joined as a member, and doing a lot of seating. I remember that was something that was very clear in those early days of my organizing, that it wasn't about like this ain't church like that where you're just gonna go lay hands on people and they finna get it. It's actually you seed a lot of what is going to potentially grow or not. And so doing that work in the South, particularly with queer and trans folks across the South, that was a lot of what we were doing, and building base, doing organizing schools, doing consciousness raising, taking up issues around, this is around the time, fast forward, anti-immigration copycat bills from Arizona started to come through, particularly in Georgia and Alabama, and was doing work on some of those campaigns. And then fast forward, helping to stand up campaigns around anti-criminalization inside of Song, where here in Atlanta, our chapter took on the fight around bail and kicked off an initiative to bail out Black mothers for Mother's Day to highlight the crisis of what was happening. And ultimately, got some rules changed and stuff around that. And built a national movement and formation to support that work and to connect more people across the country who was doing that work. And also part of that assignment was to help build, join the leadership of the Movement for Black Lives after August 9th, 2014. When Mike Brown was murdered, there was a call for folks to come together, y'all. You know, how do we harness this energy and do together what we can't do alone? That's been our critical question since we've started. And fast forward, after I transitioned out of song, stepped into this assignment with the Movement for Black Lives, where a lot of my work right now has been around stopping Cop City. Y'all know the struggle. If you don't, we can talk more about it. In addition to calling the question around one that we have, I think, as a movement, have struggled when people like defund the police, don't call them, who am I gonna call, all the things. And been working with a set of Black women in my neighborhood to do the consciousness raising in order to stand up an alternative to give our people an option. And we can talk more about that as well. But yeah, a lot of my work, some here locally, nationally, internationally as well. Yeah, but all in service of trying to get free, y'all, and to really be in service to this work. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Mary. Team Justice. That's great. And thank you, Kali, for posting some past blogs about what is to be done, organizing and the shifting focus, organizing, and please feel free to add things in the chat so that people can follow up after. So Joe, please share with us a little bit about your journey and work you're doing and any highlights.
Thanks, Melanie, and great to be with you all. I'm really delighted to be here at the close of what I trust has been a very good and productive Decolonizing Economics Summit. My name again is Joe Guinan. I'm the president of the Democracy Collaborative, which I co-direct with my colleague Stephanie McHenry. We're an action-oriented think, do tank based in the Washington, D.C. area. That's where I'm joining you from, the belly of the beast, but also Cleveland, Ohio. And we seek to build a democratic economy through political economic system change from the ground up. And I've been working on this project, a collective shared work of building a post-capitalist economy for the last couple of decades. I first started this work as a student. I grew up in the movement in England, but of Irish extraction, which gave me an interesting perspective on the state and the way in which it wields power against us all. I won't go too much into my personal story. I had the privilege recently of being on David Cobb's podcast, Redneck Gone Green. So spent a good amount of time talking about all that, but really just want to turn to the question of what is to be done, because it's really the most burning question facing us all civilizationally at the moment. And normally on a discussion like this, I want to spend a fair amount of time talking about and arguing that what we're facing is a systemic crisis. I don't think I need to do that here. You all know about it. You know that it's real. As it happens, just earlier this week, I spent some time with colleagues working on updating something we at TDC call the Index of Systemic Trends. And what that does is look at the overall trajectory of the US political economic system. And we look at data on poverty, wealth inequality, racial wealth inequality, income inequality, wage stagnation, costs of higher education, home ownership, corporate taxation, taxation of the rich, union density, incarceration rates, including by race, labor force participation rates, healthcare costs, climate change, life expectancy, you name it. And I think you all know what those indicators have really been saying about the direction of the United States since the 1970s. We first brought that index out about 5 years ago, and so we're updating it now after what have been 5 big years politically, right? Economically, geostrategically. We've seen the big Bidenomics programs. We've seen the COVID pandemic. We've seen external shocks like wars and climate effects. And, you know, to cut a long story short, the headline story is that even after the things that have been done or attempted to be done in the last 5 years, we're still on the same course, down and down and down. And so the question really, of course, is that question of what is to be done about that. And at my organization, we're working on advancing political economic alternatives from the ground up, starting Monday morning with community wealth building approaches and the like. But we see that as the building blocks of constructing a completely different political economic system based on principles of economic democracy, solidarity, ecological sustainability, racial justice, and more. And I think if we're looking at all that at the moment, then that poses us a very wicked problem in political economy terms if we look at where the system is going and what that demands of us. So if we think about three big dimensions of that crisis that we're facing, being economic inequality and the outcomes of the economy as a whole, racial injustice and that original sin, if you like, of America's constitution and political economic development, but also obviously the civilizational threat of climate change, then in analytical terms, that kind of gives us the constraints that we need to find a landing zone for effective action on. How do we address and strike at all three of those simultaneously together? And that really is a wicked problem. The racial wealth gap in the US is estimated at around $10 trillion. That's wealth that has been extracted from and stolen and denied to communities of color. And that's the equivalent to around half of annual US gross domestic product. At the same time, we're currently consuming at a rate of throughput that's just far beyond regeneration. And we've heard about this multiple times during the summit, equivalent to 1.5 planet Earths. And so to get back within those planetary boundaries, avert climate collapse, even with technology and green growth in some sectors, we're inevitably going to have to look at major cutbacks in consumption or degrowth of some kind, however unpalatable that may be. Meanwhile, economic inequality, stagnant median wages, the living standards that are challenging for so many really pose a challenge of how do we build that majoritarian political coalition that is both pre-distributive and redistributive without relying on growth, and at the same time delivering reparative justice and avoiding the pitfalls of reactionary politics against that, racialized division, the instincts to pull up the ladder by semi-privileged groups. So it really is a wicked problem. And we've got to do all this in the context of facing fascist backlash against any kind of vast redistribution, so that we can build democratic support for a program of action. And so for me, the issue is, it's not so much the question of what do we want. I think there's already been a lot of rich discussion at this summit and in general around the development of alternatives. I spend my working life on that in large part. So I'm a fan of it, of dreaming, of imagining, of political, economic, institutional design and alternatives, of working with communities and practitioners and people on the ground to realize models for that. I think we've got the models. I think we've got the institutions. I think we know what it looks like. I think there's a family emergence and resemblance of approaches, whether it's called the solidarity economy or democratic eco-socialism or the democratic economy, or call it what you will. The fundamental institutions and principles of that are really clear, I think, to many of us. In terms of, we need co-ops, we need land trusts, we need different collective forms of the ownership of capital, we need to decommodify, we need to get out of the market, push the market back. They once talked about shrinking government to make it small enough it could be drowned in the bathtub. That's what we need to do with the market. We need to push markets to the very margins of the systems that we design and so on. So I think there's already, even though there's plenty more work to be done on that, planning and trade and all these other issues, we know where we need to go. The issue is, what does a politics look like that gets us there, and how do we roll up our sleeves and work towards that in the limited time that we've got available and with the landing zone that I've just outlined ahead of us. So I think this is the civilizational question for us. I think it's incumbent upon us as the left, because largely speaking, we're the only game in town with a serious set of propositions that can actually respond to all of those challenges at once and build a world that we'd actually want to live in. Meanwhile, our opponents have got some pretty nasty things in mind for us. We already heard a little bit of that from the other panelists in terms of their experiences, but it's only going to intensify. The billionaires are definitely not planning a Green New Deal for us. They're planning on how to make the majority of the world's population superfluous under conditions of the development of AI, of automation. They're even building their underground bunkers and wrestling with the problems of what to do after the collapse occurs and how not to get murdered by their own private security details, which is a kind of ironic endpoint if you look at this from Marxist theory, right? It's the final triumph of use value over exchange value, but when it's too late, when money isn't worth anything anymore, how do they stop their special forces security guards from taking over their bunkers? It's a ridiculous way of thinking when what we should be thinking about is how to change the trajectory of the system overall so that we don't go further down into that period of collapse. And so there's a lot to be said about all this, and I'll stop here and hand back.
Appreciate you actually have launched us into the dialogue. So I'll consider that as the first of a response to this question of when you think about what is to be done. And appreciate, Joe, actually all the panelists for the initial remarks. I'm struck by what Mary said about how do we do together what we can't do alone as a critical guiding post for this question. So next would be Nick and Kali and Mary, and you can just go in sequence and feel free to reference each other's comments and to raise any other questions. When you think about what is to be done, what comes to your mind? How does this relate to the work you're doing? Nick.
Thank you, Melanie. I think number one is building solidarity, which I think I heard a lot from folks already. And that can happen in a number of different ways. Like Kelly was saying, federated groups, we need to figure out how to increase our solidarity. I mean, events like this are tremendous and wonderful. How do we have more of this? How do we get these in, more places and in person and more groups like Cooperation Jackson or Progressive Alliances or other things? So it's one component. And solidarity, especially right now, what's on my mind is the protesting students at the college campuses right now, supporting those students. There's a tremendous amount of energy going into that right now, and it's very inspiring. But I think, what we often find with these situations is we don't have a political organization or something at scale to really guide that energy in a productive manner to sustain a movement. It's a flash and then it's gone. So how do we sustain that? How do we support that? Is an ongoing question there. But ultimately, what is to be done? What comes to mind? How do we get to that place like Joe's mentioning, where workers have control of the economic and political system? I think a lot has been mentioned, and I think maybe I'll pause there and let someone else jump in. Or
Yeah, I'll pick up from there. And where I was going, Nick, is similar to where you were going. Building off of everything that's been said, but we live in an interesting time wherein when you stand back, and I think if we all look, we see that there are actually millions of people involved in the solidarity economy. Like not thousands, there's actually millions of people involved in one way or another, between, folks doing some level of food security or food sovereignty work in their communities, folks involved in mutual aid work, folks involved in that mutual aid takes on various forms, like some of the jail funds, bail funds and things like that people have organized, all throughout the US. There's folks who are organizing, trade union organizing, which is seeing a major upsurge, or organizing cooperatives, or various forms of, direct worker solidarity in either like immigrant associations or farmers associations, farmers networks, to worker centers, right? So we're not absent of organization, right? We're not absent of social movement activity. Like, there's actually a broad upsurge of that. I think the critical piece is, at this particular juncture in the road, we kind of are short. Not gonna say we're lacking, but we are definitely short of a methodology to bring that all together. So it becomes much more of a coherent political force, and can do some of what Joe was talking about, like actually begin to develop a program that expresses, that political will and the orientation. And because, we kind of lack a coherent organization, if you would, to give some level of concrete direction, we constantly get outmaneuvered by forces who are significantly smaller than us in every metric that you want to measure in terms of sheer numbers, right? Like, the political far right is not a group that it has a mass expression, don't get me wrong, but in terms of its actual organizing force in numbers, if you look at what progressives, to radicals can actually amass, they're far more insignificant in terms of numbers than what we can put on the field. The issue is they're coherent, and they're united, and they're well funded, if you want to put in contrast. But the critical piece is the unity that they have, the programmatic unity that they don't have all. They have political alignment. They're not necessarily all ideologically aligned at every single point, and they found out a way over the past 50 years of how to work within their variants to actually exercise and wield power. And they still fight amongst themselves. So some critical lessons I think we have to learn in kind of pursuing some of this question. But, the critical thing I think we have to recognize, our issue is not a numbers issue. Our issue is an organization issue, right? And we need the methodology. That's one of the critical things that we are going to have to figure out in real time to meet the challenges that I think Joe laid out. I was going to touch on that, but I think you did an excellent job of dealing with that. And we have to figure out how to do it on an accelerated time frame. Because the political collapse, we're seeing it, we're living it. And I'll, put it out there to argue with folks. I think we need to be clear that whoever wins, the executive branch of this empire come November, it's not going to be the same society, after that. The terms are going to be profoundly different than what they are. Because let's say, I'll do a little bit of scenario, and I'm going to take up too much time, but just put it this way, right? Like, I would argue that Team Trump, they have a winning hand. And that if they actually win the election, and there's a likelihood that they could, we have to admit that, particularly given how Biden seems to be kind of jettisoning any common sense to his a significant portion of his base in two strategic states, Michigan and Pennsylvania, where there are large Arab and Muslim populations that can be critical swing votes. So if they don't turn out, or they decide to vote in another election, it's basically over for him and the electoral college kind of component that he would need. But again, going back to this, so let's say if Trump wins, they'll likely have the Senate. They definitely already got the Supreme Court. But let's say Trump loses. The reality of it is they'll still have the Supreme Court. They'll have about 30 states which are already making their leadership in terms of the governors and the legislative bodies that they control, and the laws that they've already kind of put on the books are very clear that they're going to ignore most federal statutes. So they're moving very directly and explicitly towards some dimensions of civil war. And they're not going to accept, in essence, another Biden presidency. So it's going to be a different dynamic that we're going to have to inhabit. One which, if we look at what's been happening the last couple of years, from the repression that's going on in Atlanta around Cop City, I'll just speak to like the last year alone. The repression that's going on around Cop City, with the threats that they're mounting, with the RICO charges, the raids that they've done on some of the activists there. I think Mary can speak to that far better than I could. But if you look at just what's going on against the student mobilization, just in the last 72 hours, sending a clear message that they're not going to really allow, to the best of their ability, they're not going to allow for a repeat of what happened in the summer of 2020. And that's Democrats and Republicans alike. In the Democrats, I should say, are now very clear, given the nature of the animus of against empire that is raising its consciousness from the youth who are engaged in all the solidarity work on the college campuses. But they're not going to fall for the okie doke that they put out, in the fall of 2020, that you can vote for Joe Biden and get your some of your issues addressed, either in terms of medical care or student loan debt, or some of the false promises that were put forward about how they were going to deal with climate change or take the matter seriously. All those things and all those options are off the table, which leaves fundamentally the hammer for us to have to deal with. And that's a political reality I think we're going to have to kind of contend with, by being real with particularly a lot of the young folks about what this state is capable of doing, what it historically has done at some critical points in time. So folks are not, I don't think anybody's naive, but there still needs to be a warning. Like, don't think at the end of the day they won't do to us what they're doing to the Palestinian people. And we need to be very cognizant of that and not try to, fall back on these American exceptional arguments that they like to throw in our face. When you got Black people and indigenous people in this country could tell you that's a lie in every form or fashion, and always has been. So a critical piece that we got to figure out in a very short period of time is, how do we get organized? And that starts on the, organized for self-defense and organized for alternatives, and those two cannot be ignored. They have to go hand in hand given the political dynamics that we're confronting. So I'll stop there. More to say, but turn it over to Mary.
Yes, yes, this has been juicy already. I'm just taking notes and listening. But what is coming up for me with this question, and many of you have talked about it, and one of the things that's inside of my work right now is this question around mass organizing and organizations. And I think that, where I often see folks struggling around in terms of how do we create a broad container with a low bar for entry, is mostly around many of our organizations are very niche, and I think the last 2 years, and as much as, we've done a lot of work to ensure that those who have been on the margins of popular movements and who oftentimes were left out or kicked out or what have you, that many of those organizations that have, grown from that are, we're youth only, or we're, Black only, or we only cater to X, name any identity, etc. And I think that in some ways, I believe in that groups need autonomous space to be stronger in coalition spaces. And I think that very much to what folks have named, that we have struggled around how to unify these organizations in order to be able to leverage our collective power. And I think that part of what I'm after is, what is the alchemy? What is the alchemy of the strong mass organization? And right now, some of the things that I've gathered is, beyond the traditional, folks needing a strong political education program, folks need just a program of work, folks need a way to to ensure that the spirit of belonging is present. You know, I think in a world and the way, you know, the ways in which capitalism has socialized this deep individualism, that many people are still longing for connection and belonging. And I think that there's also, given the spiritual death that, you know, also with that capitalism has also provided with that deep isolation, there is certainly a need for, you know, the spiritual component. And I say that with evidence that a lot of what I've learned, as I oftentimes I think to myself, I got reborn in the South as it relates to political consciousness. But I think also it wasn't just you know, the consciousness of mind, but I think there was also an awakening in the spirit that also happened. And I think that part of our work is to also invite folks into something that goes beyond head, that goes beyond feet, but moves people internally in a way that 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 transforms our relationships to one another. And I think that, unfortunately, I feel like the left and our movements, we have struggled with what then that means, because to invite all of that typically invites, you know, all the things of what it means to organize with other humans and the struggles that come with that. And we find ourselves in different rabbit holes and sometimes get even a little mission drift around what is our actual purpose of political organization. And so I think we struggle with finding that that balance of how to hold spirit in a collective way, care in a collective way, and not just these individualized approaches that we have seen when we have overcorrected in many ways. And so I think part of our work is to harness that. And I liked what someone had, I think it was in the chat or something, but the market replacing the human relationships need to replace the market. And I think that's what we're after when it's all said and done. I think the conditions that we are under gives us no choice. You know what I mean? It gives us no choice in the matter. But I think what is also very true is that, and we must do it as a broad movement, large tent, but we also must do that in our neighborhoods, you know what I mean? Like in our families. We must do that on every scale, every place, you know, home, institution, break the isolation, neighborhood, institution, break it. And I think that that is, and I grapple and I struggle with the urgency of the moment. And also, again, that seeding work that oftentimes, and the time it takes to build trust and all of those things that, you know, we don't have the luxury of time. And as much as I like to agree with the young people, sort of like, you know, time is a social construct. I'm like, yes. And this watch right here, this calendar right here, you know what I mean? Like those things are very much what we are living inside of. And I think that, so a big part, again, like I was naming, is that this question around mass organizing and organization, both on a, you know, on a movement building aspect, but also, you know, we need several mass organizations, but really that large tent. And I think that one of the things that I think that is also super important to our posture or the alchemy, you know, my buddy Maurice oftentimes says is that our people don't have to agree with us, but they must believe in us, you know? And I think oftentimes our folks haven't necessarily believed in what the left is selling, you know, and not to be all, you know, whatever about it. But oftentimes I come across many people who are like, you know, hoop dreams, whatever. And I think, you know, given the level of cynicism that we're up against, I think that part of our work is also to not just show and prove. I think we have to agitate, you know, whether that's our other comrade organizations, folks in our communities, but the level of agitation that must be done in order to move people. And I think this is a prime opportunity, you know what I mean? you know, the president and all the advisors and everybody up there who making all these ridiculous calls and who are, you know, hell bent on the suffering of our people, like they're showing their hand. Like we have so much evidence that the things that we have taught, the things that are the things that we have been taught, the ways that we have been socialized, the promises of America are is a lie. I was trying to think of a fancy way to say it, but it's a lie, you know? And so I think we must use that as a way to foster more people to come on our side and have a sense of belief or be willing to believe in what the vision and the models, the experiments that we are trying to engage, which is very interesting because what we are calling for is for people to put their hands on the plow, be engaged in this struggle around self-determination, when oftentimes our opposition, they don't actually want people to be involved. Only when it comes to voting them in, they don't want that. You don't have to do anything, you know, besides work, pay taxes, you know what I mean? But there isn't a requirement and a commitment, if you will, to actually change the world. Like that's not what's on the table. And I think that it's a tough sell. You know, folks are struggling. You know what I mean? Folks barely got enough time in a day to do all the things that is required of us to just sustain our lives. And so I think that is also part of our challenge. But I'm reminded of Grace Lee Boggs and how she spoke about, you know, this generation, this, you know, this iteration of movement, if you will. Like we're going to be the ones when it comes down to what it is required. We're going to be the ones that's going to have to take a different kind of sacrifice than we've seen in previous generations. Like folks are going to have to be willing to give it up. You know what I mean? Give up the screen time, give up the, you know, free time if you got it. Give up some of that disposable income in service to something bigger than ourselves. And I think it's our work to, you know, continue to find ways to awaken the spiritual imperative for people to move beyond the conditions that we're in and to be a part of something large, huge, and massive that could actually shift the current conditions that we're in.
So thank you all so very much. Actually, it seems to me that we need a full summit on this very question of what is to be done, because the comments that you have all made already, each leads to another conversation, and yet we're more than halfway through this session. So what I'm going to do, rather than the individual questions, and rather than go in solely in sequence, is I'm going to put out several questions based on the things that you have said and tied to the guiding questions that we had set out. And then I'll ask for who would like to respond. So we heard from Joe about building the majoritarian political coalition, from Nick about an organization that that can be sustained, from Kali about methodology to become a political force, and that what is to be done is an organizational issue, and to be able to contend with the political reality, to organize self-defense and for alternatives. And Mary, what is to be done is to figure out how to unify, recognizing that groups also need autonomous spaces, a way to also sustain the spirit of belonging through developing human relations, replacing the market, breaking the isolation, transforming our relationships, and doing the agitation, organizing, recognizing we don't have the luxury of time, but also recognizing that that people are struggling to sustain their own lives in the process. So these points that you've made, and these are just very short highlights, and the chat is very lively. I will do my best in the next go round to check for specific questions, but here are a couple of questions that perhaps can provide structure to the next set of comments. And we'll probably have 2 more rounds. What lessons and examples can we draw from movements today that do these things, that address the organization issue, that address the issue of how do we unify, how do we build and recognize the need for autonomy? How do we recognize the urgency to both resist and to build alternatives? Concretely, how do we build organizations? How do we develop the methodology to do both of those? How do we think about the theory of change and concrete practices? How do we engage the fact that neoliberal Democrats will never be the vehicle for revolution? We're in this critical moment that elections, not only in the United States, but all over the globe, are facing some very, in terms of the rise of fascism. How do we do that? Thinking about methodology, organization, coalition, spirit, real-time struggle. And how do we be bold and audacious? Concretely, what is to be done? So does anybody would like to start us off? Okay.
I'll take the
Go ahead,
bait
Jim.
if you like on the neoliberals, because I think there's a difficult toggle that we've got to do. Mary was talking about political education and the political education of our movement and at our base as we are getting into contention, and I think it's inevitable and we have to do it for state power, which goes back to the original Lenin pamphlet, right? And we're not contending alone. There are at least two other big contenders. Neo-fascism, which is increasingly on the rise around the world and probably one of the more successful political tendencies if you look at of its growth in the last decade, but also the neoliberals. And this is where the issue of lessons and what we can learn comes in, because I think there was a powerful cautionary tale in what happened in Britain recently, which we had at the Democracy Collaborative the privilege to take part in terms of the Corbyn project there, the takeover of the British Labour Party and the attempt to take state power. We did a great job of building out what a program would look like. And if we had one, there would have been all kinds of problems, and we could go into that. But there was at least probably the best and most well-developed program for a major advanced industrial economy. And we didn't fail, we were beaten. And we were beaten on an axis of two big issues. One was Brexit, which was weaponized in such a way that we ended up on the wrong side of a populist revolt against decades of neoliberal economics, as has been enshrined in the European Union. But the other was anti-Semitism. And this is extremely pertinent today. And this has been used essentially to divide the left against itself and pursue purges and cancellations and pushing people to the very margins of political life today through a very intentional and purposeful intervention. And it's no accident that very quickly following that, we're now in the situation we see in the Middle East with genocide unfolding and uprising on campuses. And again, the issue being pushed by the media is this confected moral panic around anti-Semitism. So I think the only way we can engage in efforts like the audacious bid to kind of do a giant leap over the institutions and capture the state and try and put in place some of these big programs that would address climate and repurpose the economy on the scale of the things that were done with planning in the Second World War and after. The only way we can do that and yet not get divided and beaten back is through such a power of strength and resiliency in our movement that comes back to that essential political education that was, the bread and butter of the original movements that many of us look to and see our work in line with. And I think there's been an insufficient attention to the importance of political education for political resilience as we're trying to cover this landscape very quickly in very challenging and highly contentious situations. So I'll
Thank
pass
you.
it back.
Critically important. Someone else?
You want to go? I can pick up on a couple of points. Without sounding too down, I don't think there is a lot that we can really draw on in the positive in the current era as to kind of where we should go and what we can do. That doesn't mean I don't have no respect for the many things that are out there. It's just a recognition of how insufficient that they are, right? Like, I think we've done some great things in Jackson, but we haven't achieved state power. And we're trying to be clear about the limits of what we have done, not to so that folks learn from it, like, in the positive, and keep a focus on what we're aiming to do, right? And how much work yet we still have to do to get where we need to go. And I want to share that, because I think they're depending on what questions we want to hone in on, there are plenty of examples that we could cite, but we have to cite them with the limitations that they're confronted with, right? So, one that many people, I don't think justly, but just in terms of form, people have compared to some of the work that we tried to outline in the Jackson Kush plan, is the case of Rojava, right? In the democratic confederalism that the Kurdish people in the main there tried to practice and put into practice. And oftentimes what's been removed from that story is how they had to work and were able to work for a period of time within the margins of a global struggle. A lot of space was opened up for them to experiment because of the somewhat collapse of the Syrian state, the support that they were getting from various imperialist forces, the United States providing them with air cover, the Israelis providing them with air cover and intelligence. And this is not to disparage them for some of the choices that were made. I just want everybody to be clear, but it's to recognize the reality of the hard choices that they had to make, right? And then I'm putting this up because we're going to have to think about, like, in this struggle, who do we ally with, and on what terms and what principles, and where do we avoid some of the pitfalls and mistakes that have been made? Because one could look and make an argument that perhaps some of the things that are most similar to our context, like in the United States, occurred in Europe about a decade ago, with the rise of groups like Syriza and Podemos, wherein both of them were able. Syriza was able to capture the state government for a minute, but then they utterly failed in terms of how they managed to deal with the contradictions that were inherent in them taking over. And in short, this is my read, people may have others, when it came to making a clean break, with the institutions of financial domination and control from the neoliberals, as particularly determined by the European Bank and the German state in particular, they folded and basically sold all the critical assets of Greece, even though they put what we would call, put everything to a mass question. Even though they did that, right, and they had a no vote that was supposed to then offer a clean break, they chose to not necessarily, again, this is my interpretation, all of this is subject to debate, they chose not to believe in the people, right, and instead chose to remain with the institutions that they knew, and just try to come up with a better term of settlement, of agreement, rather than say, hey, we may need to, in this case, jettison, the euro, go outside of the Eurozone, build upon, all of the solidarity and mutual aid work that had grown up since the heart of the crisis that they had confronted in a deeper way, going back to 2006 for them a little bit earlier. And instead of relying upon that mass movement, which actually was the lifeblood of which gave them, a political expression, they turned from that because there was a bit of a fear of what the international capital strike would do against them. And sure enough, they would have faced that. And for those who are not familiar with that term is, that's basically all the financial institutions of the world saying, I'm not going to give you a penny. I'm going to try to collect everything that's due, in terms of any debt. We're going to set different embargoes upon us. And these are things I think in terms of dealing with like real alternatives, we need to start talking about. And where I came to this was a conversation that I appreciated of folks talking about political education and its deep necessity. I wholeheartedly agree with that. And I think part of that, we don't say these things to scare people, but to get them ready to the greatest extent possible as to what pursuing a real alternative will cost. And I think we need to be honest about with folks of what that it will cost when we make some of these decisions, but what level of unity do we need that enable us to kind of withstand that? And what made me think of that is when you were talking about sacrifices, Mary, right? And I will say this by way of example. I'll cite two that I think are somewhat understudied, at least in a broad sense, that I think I draw some lessons on, or I'm trying to pull from in this particular moment. And one is the Haitian Revolution, but particularly the period from 1804 afterwards. Right, there's the glorification of how they got to that point, which is justly needs to be studied. But then there's how that project fractured and wound up being subject to imperialism that we need to study, because I think that's a period where we had in an intense period of counter revolution to just the minimal social gains that were won in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And then the other one, I think, when it comes to like facing overwhelming odds and building, like an intergenerational project to withstand all the horrors of imperialism, we have to look at Vietnam and what they were able to accomplish. In essence, for those who don't know, from fighting the fighting and helping to defeat the Japanese, to then going back and fighting and defeating the French, and then going back to fight and defeat the U.S., and then fight shortly thereafter to defeat a Chinese incursion. That was about 55, almost 60 years of just straight warfare that a society had to kind of endure and organize itself to withstand, basically on the principle that nothing or nobody is going to break our will or in our capacity for self-determination. But I think we need to look at and interrogate, how did they get to that point? What was the political education? What was the structure that they got to get to that point where they basically would not surrender and were able to sustain a fight like that for that long? That was a remarkable feat that I think we need to look at and study. And I'm saying that because I don't think we're looking at in my view, I don't think we've correctly assessed the intergenerational fight that the right has taken to us, right? From Goldwater to Reagan, to where we are now. We kind of look at it as somewhat episodic, as opposed to they are engaged in a long-term generational, war to reverse all of the gains of basically the last 2 centuries, at least relative to the United States. And they have some long-term views and objectives. And other than abstract principles, we don't, y'all. Right. And part of that is because we're not, we're clear on some of the things that we're against, but we're very weak on the things that we actually unite about what we're for. Right. And part of that is because, I don't think we're still creatures of the ideological battles of the 20th century. I think we just need to be real and honest about that. But I'm saying it not to take away from the need for a certain level of political and ideological, debate and clarity. But we have to recognize that there's some new terms that we have to deal with. One of which is the climate crisis, to bring that back. Like, that should underscore a level of unity that we're going to have to reach and attain, that the battles or the struggles of the 20th century did not necessarily deal with. And then all the limitations that come with an overly focused kind of system articulated around industrial production. Not that we're not going to need that, but should that be the guiding force as to what we are united around, as opposed to building something that's regenerative and it's going to nurture us, and it's going to restore and nurture the earth, is a deeper set of politics that I think we're going to have to figure out how to get to. That could be very cross-cutting, that we're going to have to address. A lot more to say. I'll stop there though.
Thank you, Kali. Okay, so we have Nick and Mary, and then we'll have closing comments. And I see in the chat, please, there are so many different things, and I'll reflect back a few of what I've heard. But in your closing comment, a few sentences will be the question of a few sentences on what is to be done. People are asking that. Nick,
Did you want to go, Mary? Did you?
Mary?
You can go for it, buddy.
Well, I think just feeding off of what Kali was saying, I mean, a lot of really big picture stuff. And I think we need to address this at all levels. And I'm trying to follow the chat as well. Certainly like global solidarity, global struggle. I think where my focus has been more in recent years has been locally. And how do we build space for what's needed as far as organizing and educating? People are struggling harder than ever. There's less hours, you know, we're working more hours, there's less free hours. You know, the inequality is getting worse and worse. So I was just trying to think of like concrete examples from here, from where I'm at in California, of ways that how do I disrupt this brutal system? How do I, you know, start building towards what we've all been talking about? Things that, you know, I've mentioned already, like public banking, I thought was one component around addressing some of the financial issues. And, you know, in California, we've been trying to pass single payer healthcare now for years. I think, you know, taking control of our healthcare system, creating a more just healthcare system is very important. So we're not so tied to our employers, and our employers don't have that control of healthcare over us. Other issues around union organizing, you know, from all levels. You know, it's been inspiring to see what the auto workers are doing here. Simply by changing their leadership, they suddenly became a much more active and radical union, you know. So it's even, you know, if there's already existing unions, or if they're not existing unions, how do you organize? And then how do you be an effective union and really, you know, a universalist, not simply just focusing on your wages. So union organizing, worker cooperatives, I think, is something else we brought up. I mean, I'm seeing little examples here and there, more and more worker cooperatives. It's becoming more of a mainstream topic. So that's promising. So I think all those components can be repeated anywhere throughout the country. In California, we have initiative process for our electoral system. So there's potential to utilize that as a form to propose non-reformist reforms. So I think we can utilize the tools of the system that already exist for our own ends. Community land trusts, things like that, as far as addressing some of the commodification of housing. I see that like the Vienna model is becoming much more popular and trendy. There's a lot more mainstream discussion of that. I see that locally, like things that we've been proposing for decades in our local area are starting to actually get discussed with our local elected officials. So, I mean, some of the stuff, it just takes time. And I think I'll pause there. I just want to share some of those thoughts and ideas to kind of help ground us.
Delicious. A few things are coming to mind. I was in Brazil for the Jornada, which was that was in February, a meeting between folks in Latin America and the Caribbean, though the Caribbean was not highly represented in the space as part of the delegation with the grassroots global justice. And this is to my point around spirit. And I've been over here scratching my mind. I'm like, what was the word? What was the word that they used? But essentially, you know, there were folks, trade unions, folks who were working on housing, the MST, and the landless workers movement. I mean, there were so many different fronts of struggle that were present in the room. But one of the things that there were a few unifying factors, but one of the things that really stood out to me was how every day when it started, that there was a large offering, a cultural offering where people sang and brought instruments and did poetry and, you know, had some theatrics and, you know, and I think all of those things that for some might be like, oh yeah, okay, but it was prioritized in a way that was very clear that the practices that Indigenous folks have used time and time again are the technologies that we cannot forget, and the technologies that we must continue to sharpen and pass down and to share. And I thought it was a beautiful demonstration of the way in which, even in a, you know, a broad coalitional space, that there was the political unity to say that this is important enough for us to hold at least 90 good solid minutes, you know what I mean? When, you know, of course we wanted to talk about all the things, you know what I mean? What's the struggle? But the folks were like, oh no, we're going to give our attention to this because this is just as important as the conversations around, you know, the housing. How do we, you know, connect more infrastructure across these different countries, et cetera. And I think that Southern movements traditionally have also given us a recipe for the ways in which we usher in and bring in spirit, whether it's through the food in which we, you know, serve, whether it's the freedom songs we sing, whether it's the relational aspect of how, and not that the South has a monopoly on relational organizing, but that's where I learned it from, and that's where I've seen it demonstrated in the spirit of a radical hospitality that, you know, has invited, and I've seen people come into movement and be organized into movements because, you know, the spirit of care is very alive and well. And then the other thing that I wanted to name in terms of really solid example in another front, and something too that I'm just going to name this a little bit, because from my front porch, which I'm currently on, but what I have seen over the last few years is this rise in more mutual aid. And I remember the conversations I was having here in Atlanta and other places that I had traveled, where many people were like, especially young people, were like, we're tired of the electoral stuff. It's all whack. You know what I mean? We're not going to, Biden got in office. We don't care. You know, we're not going to confront power. Folks didn't want to run campaigns. I heard somebody once said running campaigns is for white people. What? That's weird. But people were kind of like, we're not on that, you know, build power, confront power type stuff, you know? And what to me was another example of how the pendulum swung, where folks were like, we're going to mutual aid. We're going to mutual aid our way to liberation. And I do believe, given, you know, the conditions that we've all talked about, that there is a need to do that. And I think that what was oftentimes demonstrated was more of a charity model, and there was no mutuality in it. And but one of the things that I think that is super important, and what I think is to be done, is that infrastructure that is being built, the relationships that is being built, the ways in which people are modeling the values that we want, you know, everyone to embody. I see it in the mutual aid, but what it often lacks is the political, the power building, the political consciousness raising, the calling the question, and the folks who get the food to say, yo, let's talk about who's responsible for your suffering. Let's talk about, you know what I mean, what is the systems that, you know, we live in one of the richest country in the world, and people cannot feed themselves. you know, and really being able to politicize, you know, those who are being directly impacted by, you know, by capitalism in this way. And so I think that there is a necessity, and I think we have to, rather folks who are doing mutual aid in their silo need to be doing more connection with organizations that's like, yo, we're a political shop, we do it at the conscious raise, we're doing campaigns, whatever, but that has to merge more, or at least to, you know, something that allows for all of those folks who are engaged in being a part of these mutual aid to continue to politicize and to politicize folks that they're encountering. And even if they're not willing to move them toward a political program that, you know, allows us to move collectively in our power, at least point them to an organization that will. And the last thing that I'll say, and this is an example of an organization that I've just been so excited about, y'all, because they started their organization doing Black Mama's Day bailout, right? Doing the mutual aid, you know, charitable, but they were clear about the political imperative of trying to highlight the crisis. But what they did is that they took that and they said, not only are we going to do that, but we're going to exercise some dual power. And they begin to work inside of the courts to be able to say, we are going to be a consistent presence here and actually, you know, be seen as a legitimate program, institution whereby we can come in court in the same way, you know, one of these other whatever groups could come in and say, hey, we got a program for anger management, whatever. They're like, we are a thing and people can come and do our thing. And when they brought people, paid folks bail and brought them into a program, they also were doing the sort of decolonizing, political education, doing the restorative justice, right? Not saying, hey, we're going to wait for the courts to decide your fate, but let's call up the person you've done harm to. Let's get your aunties, let's get their mom and them all in the room, and let's actually hold circle and do the work of finding justice on our terms, not in terms of the court. And their success has been delicious. And folks have joined organization and they have, you know, been consistently bringing people together. I believe it's every Thursday, community meetings, intergenerational. I watch young people and old people, you know what I mean, talk about cases that are happening in the community and things that have happened whereby, you know, people like, what is the solution? How do we, you know, figure out how do we, you know, deal with this harm or what have you? And so, and they're like, and after all that's said and done, and it's like, and everyone let's mobilize to get the rules changed and the laws changed and to help shut down the jail there. And this is in St. Louis, Freedom Community Center, based in St. Louis, Missouri. So I'm super excited about their model because I do believe that it is something that, you know, can also be modeled and mirrored and other folks can try it. But I think that the well-roundedness of their approach, I think is what I'm super excited about because it's holding both the build and the dismantled, one in each hand. And it seems to be working out really well in terms of being able to be a powerful force in St. Louis. So I'll stop there. I'm sure once I get off of this call, I'm like, oh, and then that one example, and then that one. Oh, can I say this real quick? Ellie, when you were talking about what was happening with the folks in Lord, my memory right now, but the sentiment of folks kind of caved into global finance, right? And you know, it was like, oh, let's get the bag. The first time I went to South Africa, I was walking to the store to get some brown liquor and some cigarettes with somebody. And that was one of the things, you know, I had Mandela's face on it and stuff. And they were, the first time I'd heard this, they said, we were so disappointed. Mandela didn't realize to the extent in which the people were willing to starve if we needed to, in order to advance, you know what I mean, what folks had put on paper as it relates to the Freedom Charter and what the young people had developed. And so I think my mind oftentimes wanders to that moment to say, what does it take to get a people to be willing to be in that level of sacrifice in order to resist the temptation of, of global capitalism and all the things that come with it, And again, I will say that is a big part of the assignment, friends. How do we get our people there? How do we ourselves, if we're not there already, get there? As many folks who are, myself, I'll speak for myself, employed, I know where our money comes from, the nonprofit industrial complex, you know what I'm saying? And I would like to think, and I try to live a very scrappy life, and oftentimes go back to the scripture. It says, Apostle Paul talks about, I've learned what it means to have and to have not, to suffer and to live well. And I think we have to be ready to make these sort of shifts in our material conditions, in order to also be able to do the type of work, the type of the type of building that we're going to need for what is coming ahead.
Thank you so very much. And so in the final minutes, each of you will have about 1 minute. And I'll say a closing, and then also for David to close out the summit. So in terms of the things that had just been raised, there's just a few of the highlights about political education, recognizing the intergenerational and the long temporality of the struggle, study, engage, the lessons, and where there have been successes, where things turned away from a longer term victory. This whole conference has been a study of what is to be done. Every single session engages one or another aspect of that. Build, engage, integrate the ideas, the vision into the work, for example, of mutual aid, so that it is a long-term project. Culture. Let folks know team justice is a thing, and how we go from here to there. So I'm just going to revert back to the first set and go in terms of time. Nick, your 1 minute is
All right,
go.
I'll be quick, just quick thank you to everybody. And yeah, I think just trying to catch up on a lot of the comments and things. Yeah, I mean, we're talking a lot about solidarity and but it's really about building like a caring economy, right? Versus this brutal system that we currently have. And I think we brought up a lot of key components to that tonight. Certainly could talk much longer. So yeah, so it's organizing, building, taking care of one another. Of course, we've talked about mutual aid, but the larger organizing component is key to all of this. So finding those groups in your area, and getting active, doing your part, doing what you can to help advance this project. And I'll just leave it at that. Thank you all.
So you can just go right through Kali, Mary, and then Joe. Lift the mute, please.
I see. Yeah, in my 1 minute, I'll try to be as precise as possible. I want to encourage folks to look at this build and fight formula that Cooperation Jackson has put out. It's a work in progress, but you can typically find it on our website and Facebook page. But I want to particularly highlight what we're calling, the practices of position. And we think that a federated way of bringing all of those associated kind of forces and practices together in a federated way could lead us to the development of the majoritarian political force that Joe was talking about. that could be the key catalyst of a transformative project here within the United States empire. And then I'll end with just a couple of comments made me think, and I'll just go out on a limb. I'm saying this because of the nature of the industrial, if you want to call it that, there's some question as to whether it's still there, but the nature of the society that we are living in by way of example, and I think by way of a particular moment. And I want to encourage folks to study, this may sound obscure, but it's concrete, to study the development of the German Social Democratic Party, basically from its founding in the 1870s up to the 1890s. I think that's a very critical piece of how you kind of do this broad scale of bringing different sectors of society, together with radical political education and political mission, to organize in your neighborhoods, in your schools, where we work, play, and pray, basically, right? They did an excellent job of that. But then they ran into a major contradiction. And this is another piece I want us to study is how that party shifted under global dynamics beginning in the 1890s with the rise of imperialism, and how it began to fracture both the consciousness, but also the organizational dynamics of that particular force, and how it kind of forced them to use the old line, basically kind of a two-line struggle and two-line of development between reform and revolution, and kind of frame the dynamic that we are still very much kind of locked in today. I think there's very much studying because this took place in a period where there was a contest between who was going to rule the roost of the world capitalist system. It was going to be either Germany, the United States, and who was going to displace the UK. And we're very much in a period now where either the United States is going to continue to run the roost or China is going to take over the game. And all of us are kind of pawns on a play field that we need to kind of understand very critically to exercise the maximum agency that we can. So I'll stop there.
Right on. I'm like, let me hurry up. My battery's low. But I think what is to be done? I think our people are deserving of a honest truth, a sober truth of what time it is on the world's clock, and also what people are doing. Oftentimes I hear too much that folks are like, ain't nobody doing, ain't nobody saying. And I'm like, yo, like I've seen the conversation about mapping and what have you. I'm like, people need to see more examples of what is possible, and what folks are doing and attempting to doing, and inspire people. Like that is part of our work. And as much as we must agitate, we also must inspire. And so I think that is going to be super crucial with this truth telling piece, while also making sure that, again, it is grounded in, and I love that someone talked about love in the chat, in which Kylie, you had named earlier that climate change is a part of, other previous movers hadn't think about that, the previous times, but we must be talking about that. And I think what we also must grapple with is patriarchy, which is also, deeply embedded in our struggles. And so I think that there is a feminist lens in which we must also engage and talk to people that I think, whether people call it feminism or not, it certainly informs much of what we want, and the ways in which we want to see the world transform. And so I think that we must do a stronger job of telling the truth about that, while also being able to do that and not see folks run away from that convo. But can we still build deep solidarity when we talk about patriarchy in a real way and demand more from each other, right? And I think that, and there was something I was going to mention, the last thing that I didn't mention, but it goes to the relational aspect piece and us being in right relationship and the connectivity. And this is a practice comes out of the Bay Area Justice Collective, I believe it's called, but the practice of pod mapping, mapping the people that are close, your 3 people you call if you harm somebody, the 3 people you've called if you've been harmed, who are your networks, what are the community organizations and institutions you're in relationship with. And some of this is about, who you're in proximity to geographically is super place-based, but I think it also, we should be looking and thinking about pod mapping and using that as a way to help begin to systematize how are we connecting with other organizations in the same way, to broaden, the people and the organizations that we are in relationship with. Because I think there is solid buckets of work happening, many different coalitions and alliances that are doing powerful, solid work. The Rising Majority, one example that M4BL helped stand up is our multiracial United Front. And I think that, I'm like, and I know that there are other formations, many who were part of this conversation the last few days. And I'm like, we should all be talking together, friends. We should be scheming together. And so I think part of it is we must reach for one another like we have never done before, and be willing to not let each other go by any means necessary.
Really hard acts to follow. Thank you all. It's been such a pleasure to be part of such a powerful conversation. I know we're past time, so just a couple of quick thoughts to leave you with. I think we need to walk on two legs when it comes to what is to be done tomorrow versus what is to be done to win overall. And what is to be done tomorrow, I think, is very much is spoken to where Nick was grounding us in the institutions of the solidarity economy and public banking and cooperative development. And there's some other strategies we can layer on top there. And in fact, it doesn't take a lot of imagination to think of the mosaic that could be weaved together from all of that could actually be an alternative political economic system. And there's even some elements to build on at scale already. 1 in 3 Americans is in a co-op. Why isn't that a more salient political fact in American life, right? As many workers own their own company as are in private sector unions. Similarly, a third of American power is already produced by co-ops or publicly owned utilities. So there's a huge basis to build our democratic economy or solidarity economy on. And I think we all know about that work and we should get to it. What to do to win overall, though, is tricky. And I don't need to repeat some of the things that Kelly and Mary were saying about building that movement and the unity of purpose and the things that have got to go into that long range struggle. If we think we are the ones that are going to win and therefore enact our full program. And I think that's a serious theory of change that a lot of us are grappling with and operating within. But it's not the only theory of change for how things develop. There's a very difficult, tricky dilemma I'm wrestling with at the moment, which is another pathway forward might be that there are things that we could do, such as to cause the majority of our program to be taken up and adopted and yes, co-opted, and we lose control, and there's a lot of risks associated with there, but really about positioning this stuff not as our own property as the program of the left as we're moving it forward, but actually as the only proper and sufficient and necessary response to the moment, which would actually involve us actually losing some control and actually taking some risks and making some unfortunate alliances and bedfellows along the way. And that's the thing that haunts me at night. So I think we got to have some tough conversations about what it actually takes to win overall. But thank you all. It's been an absolute pleasure and privilege to be part of this conversation.
Thank you all, to each of the panelists, to the summit organizers. It's been an honor to participate as moderator, and I pass it to David to close out the summit. Thank you, David, particularly, and Nicola.
At the risk of seeming foolish, let me say that the true revolutionary is guided by a great feeling of love. It is impossible to think of a genuine revolutionary lacking this quality. Che Guevara said that. And in my final moments of this incredible summit and this particular panel, let me say it's very clear that this moment in time calls for fearless experimentation. None of us have all of the answers, but what we have to do is put into practice our theories where we live, work, play, and pray. That's what is to be done immediately now, tomorrow. I also think we have to be guided, yes, by a commitment to power with feminist principles that includes a principled conviction and discipline without dogma. In the words of Kali Akuno, break it down without dumbing it down. I know as somebody who's a redneck myself, who comes out of rural poverty, people can learn. I learned. People taught me. So we have to build alternatives that meet people's concrete needs. We have to teach them why we're doing what we're doing, and we have to learn as we go. I'll end with this. We have to teach as we fight, learn as we lead. We have a world to win, and our descendants depend on us. Let's get to it. Peace.